Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Page Turners Plus. As promised during our reflections of Cleyvis Natera's Neruda on the Park, today we'll be interviewing Cleyvis Natera. Welcome, Cleyvis. Welcome to the Page Turners family.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here with you.
Yes, it is our pleasure. We really loved your novel. So, to jump off, the Watkins sisters leave a copy of Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye to signal that they were handing over the care of the neighborhood to the Tongues. The Tongues, in turn, leave a copy of The Bluest Eye and a copy of Julie Alvarez's In the Name of Salome to signal their handover of care of the neighborhood. Why those two novels, and why do the Tongues also leave a tattered book which is never identified to the reader?
Thank you so much for this question. I just love starting at the end of the book. It never happens. For me, like a lot of what this novel is grappling with is the idea of womanhood, the idea of belonging and of home. And most importantly, it's also about caretaking as both an obligation and as a sacrifice. And when I was thinking about, the writers that have had the most impact on me and my life as a writer, the two biggest influences are Toni Morrison and Julia Alvarez. And, part of the reason why I picked those two books, because although they are very much at the top of my favorites list for both of them, I think there are many other worthy books they've written that could have also been left on that beach chair for loose, Part of the reason why I picked those two is because one of them is really grappling with the pain that women suffer, especially as children, at the hands of like patriarchal society, with The Bluest Eye. And then the other one is really another way that we can think about how do we as storytellers, as women, where our stories are often erased or not centered in the way that they should. Like, how do we continue to ensure that those histories are not erased? And In the Name of Salome is really one of the most beautiful examples I've read of a writer paying homage to a living legend, a hero that I think most people, at least in the United States of America, probably have never heard of. And so, that was the reason that I picked those two, because I think it really centers and cements for me a lot of the themes in the novel. And then, I started reading when I was a really young girl. I mean, I didn't even read English when I started reading The Bluest Eye as a teenager. And when I was reading Toni Morrison's book, I never could have imagined that I would have written my own book. And so for me, the idea that Toni Morrison's book is inside a book I wrote made me also think about the person that would be holding my book, that would be writing their own book in the future. And so I gave them like a blank book that's quite worn, because that means that people would read the book that my reader will write in the future, even though I don't know their name and I don't know the title of their book. I just wanted to also give like a shout out to like future storytellers in the story.
Wow, it's really good. Eric?
Yeah, that's really good. Buenos días, mucho gusto.
Mucho gusto. Hola.
Hola, ¿qué tal? The question that I'll raise is about the tongues that are featured throughout the novel, and the tongues function as a chorus in the novel. In our experience, my experience, choruses usually sit very discreetly in the background of a story. The tongues here are a presence we feel acutely. Why did you choose to make them so prominent in the book?
Yeah, thank you so much, Eric, for that question. I feel like I'm geeking out with all of you. Like, these questions are so amazing. Well, first of all, I am a student of, in my studies, I studied American literature and European literature. And in those stories, particularly when you think about Shakespearean traditions and the Middle Age literature, the chorus often worked not so discreetly, really, in the text or in like the plays. The chorus was a way to shepherd the reader or the audience through the story by giving them context. So a lot of times the chorus would either provide background information like historical facts or like would tell us what was happening off stage, especially things that were quite violent. And what I was thinking about with the tongues is because I'm coming from a Dominican Caribbean tradition where our Caribbean traditions are oral storytelling. And the tongues, I very intentionally made them so that very often they speak as one person, even though they're triplets, so that in your own mind, you would almost think of them as like a three-headed beast, like just three tongues, that are constantly chismeando y hablando. And, they're instigators, they're hilarious at times, but they also carry quite a bit of pain in their hearts. They are the ones that have been charged with, holding the history of this neighborhood in their hands. And they have been given this responsibility of caretaking from these Black American women who have left the neighborhood many years before. And so it was really important to me to marry both like my education, my very formal education in both college and graduate school, in terms of like, what does a chorus do? It's like giving us context, giving us historical fact, but also being Dominican. When you say un coro in the Dominican Republic, it means a party. Un coro is like you're outside partying, liming, and a lot of it, it's just talking, just telling the stories. And there's like this competitive nature I always felt as I was growing up with my own family, where if you weren't telling a good story, somebody else is going to take it from you, And so for me, it was really important to center the tongues as both like an authority in storytelling, as women often are in my community, and I think in the Caribbean community, but also to like give that other context and to marry what I see as often a hostile European perception of Caribbean storytelling.
Can I ask one quick follow-up there, Roger? As you were explaining that, my mind went to the West African griot tradition. Do you see a little connection between what the tongues do and what traditionally griots would do, especially in terms of passing down the history and also being authoritative?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that is like the richest part of what I consider to be my heritage as a storyteller. I mean, I often tell people, there are certain things that happen in the book that are meant to be, there's like a section of the book that is just like lines and dots, which obviously for those readers who are listening to it, they don't get to experience it. But there's a reason the book is a book as an artifact in my mind. And then there's a reason that the story is being told the way it's being told. Because if, like there are times in the book where the narrator will say, listen, right? Even though you're reading the book. And it's really like a shout to that kind of tradition of storytelling and griots. And I especially feel like if someone comes to see me live at an event, they're going to find that I, as a writer, I'm like a certain kind of person, right? And like a certain kind of seriousness comes to the work. But who I am as a human being is quite funny and light. And, I bring a lot of different storytelling techniques to my oral tradition of presenting my work. And so for me, there's always that part of it, which is performance, which comes more with like presenting the work and telling the stories in person. And I thank you for bringing that up, because I think it's very much a part of my own tradition in storytelling that I think we inherited, right, from Africa. And it's still alive today with most storytellers of Caribbean descent and of the broader Black diaspora.
Yes, thank you. Paula.
I promise this is going to be the very last geeky question we ask you. You quote from Pablo Neruda's poem, How Much Happens in a Day, on one of the dedication pages of the novel. Now, we think that Neruda's poem kind of served as a guide to how the novel unfolds. I don't know if we're correct in thinking that. But beyond that, what does the poem mean to you? Does it have any special significance to you?
I love that poem. I mean, I've been asked to perform at certain weddings, and whenever people ask me to, that's always the poem that I think about, because I think it's one of the poems that holds within it like a whole world. And I think it, in some ways, it has a lot of the traditions that we consider to be really important. And now I'm thinking more about Middle America, South America, Central America and South America. And, you know, a lot of it is like thinking about nature and like nature versus like man-made spaces. And so you, as you all know, because you've read the book, like the book is very much concerned with this idea of gentrification, of the hardness of cities, especially for people who come from other countries that are like celebrated and are centered with nature. And so there's, to me, like something in the center of that poem that it's about a love story. And I often think about this idea of leaving a lover and then coming back, which, you know, it's part of what happens in this poem. It's like someone is leaving for the day and then returning, and that yearning, which to me, I wasn't thinking about it in the book in terms of the context of a love story between two people, but my own relationship to my country, like having left it as a child and feeling that love that I often feel for the Dominican Republic and for a country that honestly never existed. The way that the Dominican Republic lives in my own imagination, as an immigrant who now has lived in the United States for over 30 years, is of a place that never existed. And I love that there's so much longing and yearning in that poem. It mirrors the way that I feel about my own immigration journey.
Thank you. I guess I could also throw in here my favorite Neruda poem is La Tortuga, the turtle. Yeah. So I want to pick up on where you left off in terms of community, because the novel appears to be largely a meditation on the nature of community. And while the most visible exploration of the nature of community in the Northrop Park neighborhood, it seems like Luz's work environment is presented in the novel as another form of community. Did you deliberately construct the work environment as a community? And if so, what ideas did you want to explore in doing so?
Yeah, I love talking about work because, you know, I feel like we don't really talk enough about how, for many of us who are forced to work in like capitalistic driven environments, which in the United States are most spaces, even educational spaces, I would argue end up being, you know, a means of production and a means of indoctrination into like, you know, just creating more people who like spend 100% of their time focused on work. I really wanted to think about the ways in which, especially someone who comes from another country, I think it becomes a lot more stark to realize how surreal it is to be a worker in an environment that's toxic. And there's something to me that is very seductive about the promise of wealth and the fulfillment of that wealth. And so for Luz, who is really doing her best to make her parents proud, she herself is an immigrant who was born in the Dominican Republic, but arrived in the United States as a young child. And every sacrifice her parents have made for her will only be worth it if she burns herself to the ground, you know, achieves every level of success, which really means like wealth, material wealth. So I was really thinking about like, so who shepherds a young worker through through that, help them navigate it? Like, who is it that's really going to shepherd them through like that toxicity, which is, especially for an Afro-Latina or like a Black immigrant in the United States, it is a very hostile place in this country, in the United States. And I would argue for most women who are Black women in the workplace, there are still a lot of hostilities that we have to face with day by day. And so I did want to create like an environment in which we see successful Black women who have made it. And I also wanted that society of that community of workers to also show scars from what they have had to navigate, experience, to triumph in the way that we consider triumph being material wealth. And so, yeah, there's a lot to do with community. And for me, it was like very intentional. Even when Luz has an opportunity to go interview, and we know that she is poised to largely pick up where she left off with like her last job. And we very quickly realized that this is not a different environment. This is very much the same environment, only she can be like immediately in place with another group of Black successful women who are not going to care about family, who are not going to center traditional values of like, what does it mean to be a woman and to have value in society as a woman. They all are rejecting that in favor of material wealth and largely like mimicking what it means to be successful as a man in the world. So it's, you know, it's options that Luz gets. In terms of like what kind of life is she gonna choose, because at the same time she has other options which might center more of like what we historically think of as women's value in society.
I just wanted to pick up on that because Luz was a very well-educated young woman, and in most social contexts, people would say that education is seen as like the great liberator. It opens so many doors for you. So Luz got into this law firm, but it was quite a toxic environment. She was trying to keep up with the, if you could say, keep up with the Joneses. She was essentially living above her means. So was that like a deliberate choice in portraying Luz as, yes, liberated through education, but caught up by the toxic work culture where she would live above her means?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and this is almost 100% picked up from my own life because I came to this country, to the United States, when I was a young child. I went to a very small, very elite liberal arts college. I got my graduate degree at NYU, which is, one of the best universities in the United States. And when I started working, I very quickly realized that in order for me to be successful, I had to surrender a lot. And not just like the obvious things that we are required to surrender in America, like our language or our culture, right? Or like the way that we dress, but also like the way of being. I mean, the way of navigating means that you are supposed to wear certain clothes. You are supposed to wear certain purses. You are supposed to wear certain shoes. And more often than not, if you are in that kind of aspiring upper to middle to upper class space, that often means that you, as a young professional, are putting yourself in debt just to look like you belong. And so I was very, very much intentionally showing how, for a young professional, and I don't think this is only for women either, I think it happens across all the gender spectrum. Whenever you are in a work environment and you are someone that might be considered an outsider, the things that we have to sacrifice in order to fit in usually put us both at odds within our own communities, because then our communities see us as having betrayed like the central values of who we are meant to be within that community. But then also we get locked into like the machine that is like, this work experiment, because the more you spend, the more debt you're in. The more debt you're in, the more you have to work. In order to work, you have to work around the clock. Often we are not compensated for the labor that we do, especially if we are people of color. And so, for me, it was just really important to show that, and to show that, right, as she's doing it, as she's pursuing it, as she's triumphing largely in these spaces, because she has the Harvard degree, she has the Columbia degree. I mean, this is for someone who has arrived in this country without wealth, without connections, she has done something really astonishing. And she has largely met what it means to achieve the American dream. But she is like, got it inside her own body. There's like a literal emptiness that lives inside of her that she's trying to fill with all of these, all of these things that ultimately just end up making her feel more lonely.
Eric?
Wow, that's good. We could stay there for a long time, but we want to shift gears somewhat to Kuka, Luz's auntie, Eusebia's sister. Kuka in the novel has this radical surgery that she goes back home to the Dominican Republic to get, and it actually puts her life at risk. For what is arguably a bad reason to win back the attention of her unworthy husband. I was unhappy, and I can speak for myself here. I was unhappy with her choices as Eusebia was, but I can't deny that Kuka was happy with her choices and her quality of life improved because of them. What are you inviting people like Eusebia and and me to think about by having Kuka go through this and then her return and everything else that surrounds it?
Well, I'm so glad that I got this question from you, Eric, because I feel like, there's a part in Kuka's transformation where Eusebia is fuming about the fact that her sister is willing to put her life at risk, because she has this man with a wandering eye, and she feels like everything will be solved the minute she's thinner, and like, she has all of these alignments with what people consider to be more beautiful. And I very purposefully chose the word like man-made transformation, because for me it's like, it's very often this pressure that lives inside of like the billion-dollar beauty industry that makes women feel like no matter what you look like, no matter your size, there's something wrong with you. Like you are not beautiful enough, you're not worthy enough. And for, Black women especially, I think that means that you're not worthy of respect or safety. And so for Kuka, and I had a lot of fun with Kuka, because one of the things that I feel like very often when we talk about these kind of like what I consider to be like morally ambiguous choices people make, that I think very often we come down on people really hard. And, there's a part in the book where Luz is talking to her mother, Eusebia, and she says, we can win no matter what we do. If we do the surgery, people will criticize us for not being happy and not being confident with who we are, right? What today we would say body positivity, right? Like, watch out if you even say that you're not happy with yourself because you're a little bit overweight, even if the weight you have gained is because of trauma, like people will still look down on you because you're not happy and you're not confident. And on the other hand, when you don't pursue these kinds of surgeries or these kinds of things, like often what ends up happening is that women don't feel at home in their own bodies. There's like this sense of like constant unhappiness and distraction. And so, I was thinking about it too, like Kuka is the fun aunt. She is the one that is just like a riot. Even during like her worst moments of unhappiness, she still brings like a lot of levity and humor to the story. And she lives in like her own world. Like she is someone that will not be defined by like this morality in the culture that says you're supposed to just put up with like philandering men, right? Like she's like, I'm gonna find my own way of solving this problem, which for her means I'm gonna change myself and my body so that my husband loves me. And she is successful. So, I would like to invite my readers, especially someone like you, Eric, to consider not so much like, is she right or is she wrong, but like the underlying root of the unhappiness itself. And the idea that like for most of us, for most women, the pursuit of perfection will never end because there is like $1 billion industry that is very invested in our unhappiness and in making sure that we do not feel at home in our own bodies and are always unhappy with them.
So it's like it's almost circular. The way you're describing it is that this industry is pouncing upon certain insecurities that these women have, which had been created by the society at large, which is very much a patriarchal society, and a society that views things from the perspective of men. So yeah, like Luz says, and I agree with Luz's statement that you lose here and you lose there. There's almost no winning in one sense. But I also hear that you're kind of pushing back on that on Luz's statement that there is nothing to gain.
I mean, I think happiness is important, And I was gonna say, Eric, A+. I feel like I need to bring you along with me because you said everything I said in 10 minutes in like 1 minute. but I really do feel like I think happiness is important, and I have in my own life. I know many people, and not just women either, like I just know a lot of people that have gone, through surgeries and And I always grapple with that. Like when I see them happier and I see them more at peace. I met a young woman once who is in the beauty industry. And, you know, she spent a lot of time during the pandemic, like showing people how to do their makeup so they would feel like more comfortable on the Zooms. And I had a conversation. We're both runners. So, you know, we were running together. And I was like, but don't you feel like you're giving into society? Like, don't you feel like you're giving into these pressures of like flawlessness and expending all this money just to show up? And she was like, what I know is that when you show up and you don't feel secure, you are distracted and you're often not at your best. So if I can give women, any people, this sense of confidence, like put a face on. They call it like a beat, you know? She's like, beat that face, you know? And you look gorgeous and then focus on the work. Like let the way you look not be the distraction from keeping you at your best. And I think that's true too. And that's valid. And it was one of the times, and I was very much at the end of the revision process for Neruda on the Park. And after I had a conversation with my friend, I went back and I changed some of Kuka's, like the ending of her story. Like I wanted it to be like, for some people, this is worth it and this is right, even if some of us might think the underlying root of it is rotten.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Paula?
Yeah, Luz and Eusebia are two of the main protagonists in the novel. They're a mother and daughter team, and they have a huge falling out where they say terrible things to each other, which are not necessarily true. They're not necessarily untrue, even though they might be exaggerated. So I was wondering whether you think, because their relationship was certainly unbalanced, and I was wondering whether you think that this really horrible confrontation that the two of them had with each other, where they said horrible things to each other, whether it was necessary to kind of right the imbalance between this mother and daughter.
Oh, thank you, Paula, for that. Such a thoughtful and tender question. You know, when we meet this mother-daughter duo at the beginning of the book, they are kind of like poster children for what I consider to be like dysfunctional relationships. They're very loving with each other, but they are interdependent. And largely, they have kept each other from growing, both through sacrifice and obligation. And I would say between sacrifice and obligation, there's something that I consider to be like one of the truest things I've learned from both being a daughter and now being a mother is silence. That very often the way, like what animates our relationships with other people is not what we say to each other, but what we don't say to each other. Very often it is the silences in which we assume we know what will make the people we love happy. And without asking, without checking in, without confirming, we go through our lives making choices and decisions and taking actions that will affect those people in our lives because we think we know what will make them happy or what the future should look like for them. So, you know, I really thought a lot about Eusebia and Luz and how much they loved each other, because I didn't want there to be any doubt in the reader's mind that these are two people that are fiercely connected to each other and invested in each other's well-being. But largely they are harmful to each other, you know, in the way that they are. And so by the time we get, you know, to that point, you know, halfway through the book where we see this explosion, and the explosion is from both of them saying the things that, had they said it to each other, had they asked each other, what do you want? What will make you happy? I mean, the book wouldn't exist. I wouldn't have a book in my hands, right? So I'm glad they didn't say that to each other on page 1. But I also felt like it's a buildup to me that has been in the works for their entire lives. And so, yes, it's very harmful and hurtful what they said, but absolutely, I think it is the salve that they needed in order to air out a lot of the frustrations and feelings they had about their relationship. And I think it also opens up this idea of repair. Like sometimes I would hope readers don't do it the way the two of them did it, because I think there is like a more tender way that we can approach our elders and we can approach our children in trying to figure out what it is that they want, or at least have like this awareness that maybe we shouldn't make assumptions about what will make someone else happy, and that their happiness might look really different than the way that we consider they should be.
Yes, I actually wanted to shift the focus to Hudson a bit. We haven't mentioned him all morning. So when we discussed the novel, the men on the team disliked Hudson, and he was even described by one of us, no names will be called, as a materialistic villain. The women on the panel liked him, although they thought that he was clueless. Does it surprise you that there was a gender divide in our reactions to Hudson? And do you think that was coincidental?
No, I mean, I was very surprised to hear you say that there was a gender divide, because it's been really interesting to hear readers react to Hudson. And I have not been able to find a pattern yet where like, oh, all the women think he's terrible and all the men think he's great, or the men think he's terrible and the women think he's great. But I think like Hudson as a character for me presented a certain set of challenges that I was like, challenge accepted. Like he's someone who has largely lived a privileged and sheltered life, and someone who is really blind to the idea of how harmful it can be to a community to introduce wealth and, to uproot the ecosystem that lives within a community, even if you think you're doing it to accomplish something good. And so when, Hudson is the developer of this luxury building that, throws everything into chaos in this community, and he ends up being in a romantic relationship with Luz, who is, one of the protagonists. And we know Eusebia is like up in arms against any kind of development, because she wants home to stay home. She doesn't want anything to disrupt it. So I was really invested in like Hudson as someone who's also a climate activist and someone who has really like done his best. So when we meet Hudson is largely feeling really disillusioned and heartbroken by how little can be accomplished by wealth. And like, there's a limit to wealth and power. Like there are certain things that are even bigger than that. And so when Luz meets this man, he is feeling kind of hopeless. And he also shares that same kind of loneliness that she shares. And so for me, showing someone who is limited both in like his perception of like the harm he himself can cause was really important. But also like, I didn't want him to be a villain. Like, I think that he often can come across as like, like being someone who is offering Luz a world that is really surreal and weird, especially when you get toward the end of the book, where like you find out that he's someone who really has a wild idea about how like we're gonna survive climate catastrophe. But he's also someone like the women at work who are offering Luz this other way of being. For me, Hudson also needed to present to Luz a very different way forward for her life and give her the option to choose. So yeah, I mean, I definitely love hearing how differently this character lands on people, because when I was writing him, I also felt very torn about him. I was like, are you good? Are you bad? I don't know. I know you're trying your best and failing miserably at it. And I feel like those characters like bring with them such richness for these kinds of conversations.
Okay, I got to stay on Hudson, because as a man on the panel that discussed the book previously, I know I stated that I didn't like Hudson, and I still don't like Hudson. But there's something else. But there's something about Hudson that I want to ask you though. It comes out in that first meeting. Hudson, Luz, and Hudson's friends are meeting at Hudson's place, and one of the people there revealed that the Norma was Hudson's like nanny, his black nanny. So I have to ask you this question. Did Hudson have jungle fever? Was he objectifying Luz because she was a black woman, and not only just a black woman, but also an Afro-Dominicana?
Well, listen, things just heated up in the chat. Yes, I mean, I definitely feel like part of the allure that Hudson feels for Luz is very much savior complex. I mean, and I don't even think that this is limited to like white men, honestly, but I certainly in my youth was confronted with certain wealthy men who I really thought they saw me as a project. Like, I think that they felt like because I came from limited means or because I was lost in some aspects, you know, when I was younger, like trying to figure out like, how am I going to be a writer? Can I be a writer? I just feel like that can become very attractive to a certain man of a certain means, because it means that like they can come, right? And it's the same narrative really that is harmful to women, that is just as harmful to men, that tells them that like their worth in the world is like saving people who don't even need to be saved. Nobody's asking you to come save me. I'm like a grown-up. I can make my own way through the world. And I think for me, that dynamic between Luz, you know, one of the things that I often, and I'm a teacher, I'm a college professor, and I teach, you know, emerging and more established writers to like work on fiction. And one of the things that I'm really interested in exploring, and I invite my students to explore, is like, how do we subvert narratives? And with Hudson and Luz, Hudson might be powerful, part of the dominant class. He might have so much wealth that like he doesn't even know what to do with it. He has inherited his wealth from people who more likely than not own people. You know what I mean? Like, you don't get that rich without having had a hand in like some really horrible human experiments for capitalism, right? And one of the things that I was really interested in showing is like subversion of that narrative, because when it comes to Luz and Hudson, like Luz has something Hudson wants, and it's up to Luz whether or not she's going to give it to him. And for me, that's really important, because especially as women of color, immigrants, I feel like we are very often portrayed in narratives, especially when it comes to like wealthy men, as like being helpless, hopeless, powerless. And I think most of us know that that's not true when it comes to sex, right? Like, that's not true when it comes to love. And that's not true when it comes to relationship. Very often the power dynamics are flipped regardless of socioeconomic status. And so I definitely was very interested, Eric, in like looking at that, looking at his kind of allure that he has for this woman who is, you know, she's in a very difficult economic situation when we meet her at the beginning of the book. And he largely feels like, I will offer you rest. I will offer you ease.
Yeah, I like that. That's deep. But I can't help but also think, and I wrote this in my Goodreads review of the book, if you want to read that.
Oh, I'm going to read it. As soon as this is over, I'm going to find you, Eric.
that the Hudson character reminded me of the same type of character that I read in Kylie Reid's Such a Fun Age. I don't know if you read Such a Fun Age.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Kylie Reid.
Good. That dynamic of the white man character with the protagonist, it reminded me. It was different, but it was still kind of reminiscent of that same type of dynamic of that saviorhood and that sort of thing. I don't know if that was in the back of your head in terms of having this Ivy League educated man be central to the story.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of the reason why I made them both have graduated from Harvard, because it is like a very different story to like be a first generation, or I guess they call them 1.5 when you were born in the other country but came as a child. It's very different to have these pedigrees, you know, like it doesn't, a Harvard degree for like an immigrant person does not mean the same as a Harvard degree for a legacy, right? Like someone whose parent, grandparent, great-grandparent, and the one before that all went to Harvard. Like now we're talking about power and wealth in a very different way. And so, yeah, for me, it was really important to tap into that and also to like not diminish like what it means for for people to want to do what's right, you know? I think that the potential for true societal transformation lies in people not making assumptions because they have their wealth, that they know how to fix what's wrong with communities where they're affected by poverty and by other class issues. But I think that like the potential or the wish to do well or to do things for society are not enough. Like, you know, what Hudson is trying to do is not enough. Trying to save people is not enough. You know, you're more than likely going to cause harm when that's like your outlook, that you can come in there and fix the problem.
Yeah. As one of the women on the team, I will say without shame that I liked Hudson. I thought that Hudson was sensitive and was willing to learn. So even though he was clueless, if he and Luce, well, okay, no, that will give away part of the talk. But I thought he was willing to learn, and I liked that about him, and I liked the fact that he was sensitive. So even, you know, I was willing to forgive him for the fact that for being clueless. No, let's still stay on Hudson. We're probably giving him too much time, but
that's okay.
I still have some questions about him. The same team member who called him a materialistic villain wondered whether you know, Hudson is a great fan of Pablo Neruda and of his poetry. And he was wondering whether you deliberately made this materialistic villain love Pablo Neruda's poem to make a political statement, because Neruda is a socialist, and Hudson is in that team member's mind a materialistic villain. So he was wondering whether you were trying to make a statement, a political statement about that.
I mean, I love this question. This is such a sophisticated and complex question. Kudos to that reader for bringing it forward and for, I think, like really seeing into a lot of my intentions when it comes to positioning Pablo Neruda. You know, for me, there's a triangle in the book that is like Pablo Neruda, Vladimir, and Hudson, you know? And I think that there's like different kind of versions of what I perceive to be this kind of idealistic sense of how we can save the world or fix the world, right? And Pablo Neruda, who, like, one of the reasons why I love Pablo Neruda, I love his poetry, I love his work. I also loved who he was as a, like, I would say as an activist, you know, like very much he was someone who like always was pushing for like the underclass. He was always someone who thought that like art should be accessible to everyone. So whether you are a stay-at-home mother, whether you are a doctor, whether you are a garbage collector, that poetry should be accessible to everybody and that it should be enjoyed by everybody. And that hasn't always been the truth, right? Like of the way that literature and poetry have been seen, right? Like who is it for? More often than not in like wealthy societies, it was really meant to be for like the wealthy. And so I respected that. But also Pablo Neruda is very problematic. I mean, in his own memoir, his autobiography, he spoke about sexually abusing a worker at a hotel. And so when I thought about this idea of like someone who holds such strong, powerful, important views, whose work has lasting merit, because I do think that he is one of the most talented and outstanding poets that ever lived. He was also very toxic and like a horrible human being who abused people, you know, particularly like was sexually violent and raped a woman. And so for me, like it was really important to like tie like, you know, this legacy that I see as like men who mean well, but cause a lot of harm, and put it in a spectrum that I think is also tied to like socio-political movements, like socialism, like democracy, like, you know, what I would consider now, even if we don't want to call it a political movement, is capitalism, because so much of like the rules, the regulations, the laws are animated and funded by, you know, lobbies and things like that. So like now we know that so often what's motivating law is who's willing to like fund campaigns, you know? So for me, like all of that is in the same spectrum. And I so appreciate this question from this reader, because I think that the connection between Pablo Neruda and Hudson isn't just like people who want to make the world more beautiful through their actions, right? Like Pablo was doing it through poetry. Hudson is trying to do it through buildings and beautifying neighborhoods. It's also about like at the core of it, there's like a way in which they perceive their own dominance over nature and society that I find worth discussing and excavating and talking about.
Yeah, it's always good to end on the political question. Unfortunately, though, we're out of time. So we want to thank you so much for agreeing to be interviewed by us, Cleyvis. Just to let the readers know, next time you see us, we'll be reflecting on Miriam Chauncey's Village Weavers. But before we leave you, we have a treat for you. We have a reading by Cleyvis Natera, author of Neruda on the Park. Thank you for joining us and have a lovely day.
Eusebia willed herself to stop that sensation of movement, of falling and twirling through the air in opposite directions at once, a nauseous feeling. Usually, this was the moment that forced her to close her eyes and seek lower ground. Not today. On weak knees, she walked to where the women stood and inhaled deeply as she leaned over. Beneath them, it was as if a bomb had exploded. Bricks, pipes, concrete, refrigerators, stoves, even farther away, discarded toys, a doll with matted blonde hair, a blue truck missing a wheel. She was puzzled at the sharpness of her vision. I have an idea on how to stop all of this from happening, she said. Her friends, the tongues, looked at her curiously. What if we just scare everyone into thinking this neighborhood is really bad? She said. The women smiled, thinking it a joke, brilliant in its simplicity. How would we do that? They asked. Eusebia spoke in a confident way, as if this conversation had already happened. She explained she meant recruiting their neighbors who would act out crimes around the neighborhood with other volunteers who'd be the victims of these crimes. You mean fake crimes? They asked. No, not fake, real. Who'd be crazy enough to move to a neighborhood amid a crime spree? What kind of crimes? They asked. Eusebia was quiet. She had come up with a list, but she knew if they participated, helped formulate it, they'd be in. What would scare you? She asked. This is the kind of idea that can destroy a community, they said. That can save it, she corrected. The women stared at her worried. They understood she was serious. She had moved too fast. Eusebia extended her arm around the neighborhood, lovingly sweeping all they could see. Over by their side of the park, Raul's shipping place, the cleaners owned by the Chinitos who were born in DR, the liquor store, the dentist. She wrapped her arm around herself, signaling what they couldn't see, the smell of water boiling for root vegetables, of meat sizzling in pans, laundry being folded, children being kissed, phone calls back home to people who needed help, who would be lost without the support of those who traveled here. If we don't stop it, Eusebia said, it will not be stopped. Thank you.